when members of a president's own party start organizing late-night meetings to block his use of emergency powers. You're witnessing something that goes deeper than typical political friction. This isn't the usual back and forth between parties, or predictable opposition from moderates worried about their districts. This is a group of Republican senators calculating that the constitutional cost of staying silent has become greater than the political cost of pushing back. And that calculation reveals something fundamental about where lines get drawn. When emergency authority stops looking like crisis response and starts looking like a way around Congress entirely. Emergency powers exist for a specific purpose. When natural disasters strike, when sudden national security threats emerge, when situations demand action faster than normal legislative processes can provide. Presidents have legal tools to act decisively. Those tools concentrate authority in ways the constitutional system normally prevents through separation of powers. They allow money to be redirected without standard oversight. They compress timelines and bypass accountability mechanisms. The constitutional justification for all of this is urgency, the idea that normal processes simply can't respond adequately to abnormal circumstances. But what happens when emergency declarations stop being responses to sudden crises and become strategic tools for achieving policy goals that couldn't get through Congress the normal way? That's the question Republican senators are now confronting, not as abstract constitutional theory, but as immediate practical reality. The president has been discussing using emergency authority to redirect federal funds toward objectives that Congress specifically declined to fund through regular appropriations. That's not hypothetical, that's a concrete assertion of power that, if it becomes accepted precedent, fundamentally changes how the system works. Senator Rand Paul has articulated this concern directly, that emergency authority was never designed to circumvent legislative disagreement. When Congress considers funding requests and decides not to provide them, that's not a crisis requiring emergency powers. That's the constitutional system working exactly as designed. Legislative disagreement isn't a bug to be fixed through executive action. It's a feature built into the structure deliberately to ensure major decisions require broader support than one person's judgment. The National Emergencies Act itself was passed precisely because Congress recognized the dangers of open-ended emergency authority. It includes termination mechanisms, oversight requirements, and procedural constraints meant to ensure emergencies remain genuinely exceptional, rather than routine. When those exceptions become normalized, when they're deployed not for sudden unforeseen crises but as calculated strategic moves to advance contested policy goals, the constitutional architecture starts operating according to different principles than it was designed to follow. What makes this moment particularly significant is where the resistance is coming from. Senator Mike Lee has been systematically making the case that Congress controls federal appropriations, and that authority isn't procedural courtesy, it's fundamental constitutional design. Senator Susan Collins has stated clearly that emergency powers must be reserved for genuine national emergencies, not deployed as convenient tools for bypassing legislative disagreement. These aren't fringe voices or predictable moderates. These are senators who've defended executive authority in many contexts but have concluded that this particular expansion crosses a line they can't ignore without abandoning institutional responsibility. Behind the scenes, coordination is happening that doesn't involve dramatic press conferences or theatrical confrontati. Republican senators are comparing constitutional concerns, calculating vote counts, identifying which specific uses of emergency power represent boundaries they can't accept. They're communicating through public statements and private channels that meaningful limits exist, that constitutional lines exist beyond which party loyalty yields to institutional obligation. This matters because precedents established today don't belong to one administration. Once emergency authority successfully gets used to override congressional appropriations decisions, that expanded power becomes available to every future president regardless of party. Senators who might support current policy goals are forced to consider what those same powers look like in different hands pursuing different objectives. The shortcuts accepted now become the precedents invoked later. The president interprets this resistance through a fundamentally different lens. For an administration that has consistently prioritized loyalty and unity as paramount values, senatorial opposition rooted in constitutional principle feels like betrayal, rather than legitimate institutional disagreement. But that's exactly what makes this confrontation resistant to normal political negotiation. What Republican senators are defending isn't a particular policy preference. It's a foundational principle that governmental power justified solely by personal will, operating without institutional constraint, represents the concentration of authority the constitutional system was designed to Prevent. Looking ahead, crucial. Procedural votes are approaching. Individual senators are weighing political costs against constitutional costs. The administration is considering how to respond to unprecedented resistance from within its own coalition. The outcome will establish precedent extending far beyond this moment. It will determine whether emergency powers retain their character as exceptional tools for genuine crises or become normalized instruments for bypassing legislative disagreement. It will reveal whether congressional appropriation authority still functions as meaningful constraint or has eroded into symbolic gesture. Here's what's fundamentally at stake. Complex institutional systems don't usually fail through single catastrophic events. They erode gradually through repeated testing, systematic challenging, progressive normalization of previously exceptional practices. This is the moment where enough senators have decided a particular boundary can't be crossed without decisive resistance. Whether that resistance holds, whether institutional principle can override partisan pressure when the two come into direct conflict, that's the question being answered right now. For coverage that tracks how constitutional confrontations like this develop beyond the initial headlines, subscribe to Allura Updates, because understanding whether emergency authority still has meaningful limits isn't about one administration or one policy fight. It's about whether the process through which power gets exercised still matters when the outcomes remain contested, and that question outlives every news cycle and every political alignment.